Hello, and welcome to the 2025 Annual Conference and Book Fair in Los Angeles. I'm Michelle Morano, a member of the AWP Board of Directors, and here is a visual description of myself. I'm always tempted to say I'm very young and very beautiful, but instead I will just say that I am a medium-height woman with short salt and pepper hair, wearing a black blouse and navy slacks. The Association of Writers and Writing Programs is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers and the academic programs and organizations that serve them, all while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I just feel like I want to say that again. All while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I'm a member of AWP's Board of Directors, but first and foremost, I'm a member of AWP, longtime member. Membership with AWP provides me with writing resources year-round, but just as importantly, it allows me to support other writers, especially those who are just starting out. My membership dues help writers find meaningful careers and publication opportunities and make services like the Writer-to-Writer Mentorship Program possible. If you aren't already, I invite you to become a member today. We are delighted to bring you this event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our conference sponsors and the literary partner hosting this event, the Center for Fiction. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. Before we start, I just do need to do a couple of housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phones. I'm going to do that myself right now. Remember that there's no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Please respect the seats that are marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. And after the event, there will be a book signing. Please give the authors about 10 minutes to get there. And the book signing this year, because the hallways are a little bit tight, will be down the hall, past the entrance to the book fair. And then on the right, you'll see an area that's marked for featured writers. So thank you. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Melanie McNair.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie McNair. I am the Senior Director of Public Programming at the Center for Fiction. It's really wonderful to see all of you here, wonderfully spread out. You all have your own space. So I'm going to do a few things. The first thing I want to do is read a statement. The event organizers would like to acknowledge that we are gathering during a time of struggle and violence against many peoples. The Palestinian people continue to be brutalized by the decades-long American-funded genocide and colonial violence of Israeli apartheid. We also stand in solidarity with victims of genocide in Sudan and Congo, and with the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands this conference is being held, including the Tongva, Tataveam, Serrano, Kiz, and Chumash tribes. We stand firmly against anti-Blackness and recognize that police violence and all white supremacist violence must be named and opposed. We stand with immigrants against whom the current federal administration is carrying out horrific acts of violence, imprisonment, and erasure. These forms of violence, along with transphobic violence being legislated across the United States, endanger the lives of trans, queer, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people. Therefore, as we begin our event, we wish to underscore that none of us are free until all of us are free, and that all anti-racist, liberationist, and decolonial struggles are intertwined. There were a number of organizations that wrote that, and I did not copy and paste their names, but thank you to them. And all of that is very pertinent to the topics that we're going to be talking about here. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to say a little bit about the Center for Fiction. We're a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit based in New York City. We support the creation and celebration of fiction. And we have a number of programs, including writing workshops, reading groups, public programming with amazing author conversations, an emerging writer fellowship for New York-based writers who have not published a book, and a first novel prize that is in its 20th year this year. We're in booth number 353, so stop by and see us, sign up for our mailing list. A lot of the things that we offer are virtual, so you don't have to be in New York City. And I'm biased, but I want to share everything we do because it's pretty great. With that, I think I'm going to introduce our panelists. We did have a change, which is the best change I could imagine is we added Mecca Jamila Sullivan. So we've got 4 amazing writers on this panel now. Starting with Kazim, professor of literary arts and comparative literature at the University of California, San Diego. His recent books include Sukkun, New and Selected Poems, the novel Indian Winter, and Black Buffalo Woman, an introduction to the poetry and poetics of Lucille Clifton. A translator and editor, he founded Nightboat Books, which publishes innovative and experimental literature in 2004. And really, there's nothing that this writer can't do. If you haven't read his work, you're in for a real treat. Andrea Lawlor is the author of a chapbook, Position Papers, and a novel, Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl. Their stories, essays, and poems have appeared in publications such as Plowshares, the Brooklyn Rail, and the New York Times. They are the recipient of a Whiting Award for Fiction, as well as fellowships from Lambda Literary, Radar Labs, the U-Cross Foundation, and MacDowell. They are an associate professor of English and creative writing at Mount Holyoke College and live in Western Massachusetts. Henry Hoke is the author of 5 books, most recently the memoir Stickler and the novel Open Throat, finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Barnes & Noble Discover Prize, and the James Tate Black Prize for Fiction. He co-created the performance series Intertext in Los Angeles and edits Humor at the Offing. And our last-minute addition, Mecca Jamila Sullivan, the author of 3 books, Big Girl, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and winner of the Balcones Fiction Prize, and the Next Generation Indie Book Award for First Novel, The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, winner of the William Saunders Scarborough Prize from the MLA, and the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, winner of the Judith Markowitz Award from Lambda Literary. She has earned honors from Breadloaf, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the Mellon Foundation. She was an emerging writing fellow at the Center for Fiction, the NEA, and others. Originally from Harlem, she is professor of English at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Please give them a very warm welcome and come on up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I think we're each going to take a turn and say a few things or read a few things, and then we're going to chat, right? Okay. We didn't actually decide what order we were going into, so we were just having a little bit of a discussion. Weird fiction in English and speculative fiction in English have their common roots in the novel Frankenstein. When in 1816, the 19-year-old Mary Shelley wrote about a man creating another man, she not only nailed one of the last nails into the coffin of the Enlightenment, but she also ended the notion that logic and reason could promote advancement in European capitalist society. The novel was written against the context of the debate about the institution of slavery in England. The slave trade had been abolished some years earlier in 1807, but the debate about the institution of slavery itself was still raging. By the time she published the revised version of Frankenstein in 1831, which is the version that most of us know, and if we've read that novel, we've probably read that 1831 revision, she incorporated a lot of the philosophical conflict between the created being rebelling against and demanding of its creator. And so the earliest literary critics who were writing about Frankenstein were contextualizing the creature as black, as an enslaved being. He's not literally black in the novel, actually. He's described as being pale, pearly white skin. But the critic Elizabeth Young has actually written a book called Black Frankenstein, The Making of an American Metaphor, in which she talks about the Frankenstein story, not only specifically about the notion of bondage, and what responsibilities the creator has to the quote-unquote created, but also as an American narrative itself specifically. And interestingly, Toni Morrison does, in Playing in the Dark, Toni Morrison invokes Frankenstein. She doesn't discuss it, but at the beginning of the book, she does invoke it. Frankenstein also ended the notion of, I think, political transcendence at the same time as the concept of the cohesive, rational narrator. So if you read this book, if you've seen the many films, and then you read the book, you're surprised, probably surprised, because it's a nested narrative. It opens with a series of letters from a sea captain to his sister. Then we hear from Victor Frankenstein. Then we actually hear from the creature himself, who is literate and is a logical, reasonable being and tries to reason with his creator. And at the heart of the whole book, and it's actually textually speaking, it's halfway through the whole book, is the story of a refugee family, which is a blended family. It includes a brother and a sister and their father, and then an Arab Muslim woman named Shafi, who is taking asylum with this family. There's no mother. Nobody in Frankenstein has a mother. I don't know if you read this book. All the mothers are dead. Mary Shelley's mother was dead too. But Shafi is a really interesting figure. She's at the heart of the book. So at the heart of Frankenstein, and it's the core of this argument between the creature and Victor Frankenstein, is from Shafi. And she is an Arab Muslim woman who starts learning feminist ideals and starts espousing feminist political ideas that Mary Shelley was drawing from the work of her mother, who is a philosopher and gender warrior, Mary Wollstonecraft. So you have this queer novel, weird fiction, half political philosophy, an alternating nested narrative, polyvocal, multiple narrators, a lot of like the untrustworthy narrator. You don't really know who's telling the truth about what in the story. It's right there at the very beginning. And American literature, too, begins with Frankenstein, because Herman Melville read Frankenstein and was obsessed with that book. And then you see these concepts from Frankenstein, the like vengeance of Ahab, the venue of the ship. They are all drawn from the framing narrative of Frankenstein, which is the ship's captain, Robert Walton, and his conversations with Victor Frankenstein. One thing that I wondered about polyvocal and genre-fluid fiction is it a particularly feminist form, since it had its roots in Shafi's liberation as espousing those ideas of Mary Wollstonecraft in A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And when I was writing the preface of, we did with Coach House Books, the collected novels of Christiana Gunners, who is a writer who wrote, 5 very, she calls them, interestingly, in the 90s, Christiana Gunners described her novels as transgeneric, or meaning like transgenre. And so in another essay that I wrote that you may know, I won't go too deeply into its argument, but it's called Genre Queer, and it connects genre and gender as primarily as reading practices, how a reader sees the text that they are reading, whether that body is a body of words or the body of a person. And so as I was writing the preface to Christiana's book, I started to realize, who are the writers who are writing lyrical fiction, polyvocal fiction, fiction that moves between genres of fiction and philosophy. And I was primarily interested not in contemporary writers, but the legacy, the 20th century, earlier 20th century. And as I made the list of writers, I started to notice the commonality. And this was the list of writers. Christiana Gunners, Elizabeth Smart, Anne Quinn, Anais Nin, Marguerite Duras, Carol Meso, Aoife Figes, Janet Kaufman, Anna Caven, Christine Brooks Rose, Ursule Molinaro, Fanny Howe, and Teresa Hakyung Cha. So you see there is a commonality between all of these writers, one particular commonality. So I wondered specifically if genre fluid fiction was a particularly actually gendered, queer, feminist form in and of itself, in a way that the kind of modernist, old boys, legacy of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and the other writers of that time was specifically not, actually. So that's one of the questions I want to leave you with, and I think Andrea's going next after me. Thank you.
That was amazing. Hello, thank you so much. That was amazing, Kazim. I'm deeply honored and excited to be here with some of my favorite writers, and thank you so much to Melanie and the Center for Fiction for putting this together. I wrote a novel which, I think of in terms of queered form or in some ways, like a picaresque as a trans narrative, which is something Brian Blanchfield wrote about in Book Forum and was helpful for me. And I thought I'll read from that, but then I was talking to Kazim earlier, and I think I had a Bartleby moment where I was feeling like, no, I'm gonna read my prose poems. What I'm working on, I turn out to be, I think I'm a cicada. So every 15 or so years, I guess I'll emerge with something. And so I'm at the sort of I realized this winter that I've been writing this series of position papers for almost 15 years, so it's about to be a book. And I thought I'd read some of them. I guess, what will I say? All you really need to know is that I am imagining a near future, speculative, queer, anarchist, utopian, seceded Western Mass. And I actually have 2 chapbooks containing these both named position papers, because I forgot you should name chapbooks different things. Or maybe I would prefer not to. I love this idea of Frankenstein and being against reason. Okay, so this is the first one I wrote, and what will I tell you? That's it. Okay, position paper number 1, cars. In my country, we will have modular cars. Each car module will hold 1 person or a storage unit, and we will snap our modules together or apart. In our modular cars, we will not be lonely driving back from dinner or the reading to the same location after coming to dinner or the reading from different locations. We will have the option of going home together, debriefing on the way, so when we get home, we can go right to bed. And we will save fuel this way, though the fuel will not be precious, will be made of plastic waste. Our modular cars will run on composted Apple IIe's, predictor kits, rainbow barrettes, Palm Pilots, and parts of station wagons, which we will train special bacteria to first eat, then shit out in the form of a paste. That's right, yeah. Fairly compensated workers with collective bargaining rights will collect this paste, and other fairly compensated workers with collective bargaining rights will turn this paste into fuel, and still other fairly compensated workers with collective bargaining rights will deliver, sell, and insert the fuel. Or maybe the workers will come to decisions through a consensus model and will not own so much as share the means of production. In my country, 1/7 the size of the current United States and not so federated. Note that I didn't know what federated meant when I wrote that. I think it sounded good, but now I actually believe maybe it should be federated. We will systematically use up all the broken plastic objects people's step aunts and fathers have been hoarding in their garages. We will thank our hoarding relatives and comrades in our minds as we watch the stars from our downy bed, all talked out. So I'm gonna read a few more of these. Am I doing AMSR to you? Do I stand back? Or you like it? Okay, this is position paper number 4, taxes. Is this better? You liked the thing. Whisper? Whisper? Oh, okay. In the new country, is that better? In the new country, the children will read with fascination about money economies when they borrow books from our neighborhood or central libraries, which will be open all night, every night, and all day, every day. We immigrants will try not to worry about the children's games of cash register, which they will play in the common building when there's rains, scattering handmade tokens in front of the fireplace. We will try not to call them baby capitalists, even in jest. We will be so kind to the babies, and we will let them pick out their own clothing from the clothing depots. We will not impose our fashion agendas once they are old enough to point. When they are very young, we will dress them in tiny animal costumes, which we will create by sewing ears and tails on earless or tailless garments. The babies will later look at drawings or photographs of themselves and remember in flashes their kittenhoods, lapping milk and sleeping among their litter mates in our arms. Let's see. A little bit later, from when I started this, I thought, oh, here, this will be a funny footnote to history. It was 2016, and I wrote one called Donald Trump. Sorry to say the name. In our new country, we will notice, cherish, entirely disregard time. Inhale hours and exhale days. Float and surf and snorkel into the minutes and years. Time like a blanket over or under us, wrapped around our beach-chilled skin. Our time will be free of owners, a fact of life on this particular planet, like air and sea, like the moon, like moss or dung or fingernails, like baby deer, like our love, like that song you dreamed last night and forgot this morning. Time will be sovereign to itself alone, but made up of us as much as we are made up of time. We will be time's moving parts, time's tiny turtle spawn, time's tentacles reaching out through the underwater galaxy. How will we rid our countless old earth languages of the ancient metaphors? How will we sift out the good, refusing to spend or borrow or waste or save? This one is position paper number 25, Sharks, and it's the closest to an homage to Henry Hoke's Open Throat that I can get. In the shark's new country, also the shark's old country, sharks will feast on fatty grays, on morsels of sea turtle and smooth long-finned squid, as the land floods and ebbs in moony rhythm. In the eelgrass's country, also the widgeon grass's country, the smallest scuttlers will tickle as they shelter. The oysters will bulk up against the blades. Piping plovers will snack on salty worms. We will leave the sharks to their sharking, the grass to its grassing, the seals to their curious parades, watching us watch them as we dance improbably on the shore, work break discos on the dusk-cool sand. I think I'll read like 2 more. This one is called Genocidal Theocratic Ethnostates. In our new place-time, we will remember those ancestor heroes who live-streamed from sieges and chanted on streets and rescued strangers from rubble and marched downtown and blocked highways, who ran out for bread and delivered babies in hallways and set broken bones and dug graves, who organized fuel sharing and found water and rocked teenagers to sleep, who sheltered little bodies with their own bodies, who blocked the transactions of the old world, who unbuilt the walls, unbuilt the states, our ancestors who neatly saved bricks, melted down steel, remediated fields, who showed us how to make new in the shell of the old. And then maybe I'll read this one and then actually one more. This one is position paper number 53, National Archivist. This is a newer one. In the new place, which will also be the old place, we will save useful things neatly, with backups, but not too many, not too much. Everyone will train in some archives, teaching methods and learning our shared reverence for research, which is reverence for knowledge, which is reverence for community, which is reverence for being, which is reverence for this earth and all universes. We will keep kitchen archives and garden archives and comms archives and decisions archives and process archives and experiment archives, and we will consult these archives when we need background or inspiration or instruction or for pleasure. The great pleasure of the archive, the great archive of pleasure, we will call this art, how we spend our days and nights. And, I've put these all together, there's a bunch of them, and then I realized, as part of making it a book, is it a novel? I don't know, there's no characters or plot. But maybe we'll talk about that. I realized I need some appendices, because that is what makes a book serious. So I have some appendices, like a list of the jobs that will become obsolete, and spoiler, they are not the jobs that have currently been deemed obsolete. They start like hedge fund manager. But then I realized that it would be fun to write a bunch of sort of like homages to the heroes of the revolution from the future. And so they're acrostics. And this one is, should I read it and tell you, or tell you and read it? I'll read it and tell you, okay. Like Peter Parker, this masked kid on the street, some unlikely newsprint anti-hero, sacrificing his own best interests, his pure time, relinquishing a moral higher ground, giving notice to the quarter-zipped hundreds, those lonely, ill-gotten gainers. Wake up or die, says the voice of billions. May your tight back release in your cell. May your comrades always clean up your fade. May your bright eyes shine now and always. May the librarians find you a thick novel to give comfort. May your commissary be filled by new friends. I'll be here, writing poems, I guess. Nothing else I can make, only words and breakfast and the bed and time, which I make at night, reading to the kid from some multiversal instance of even now we can find another way. So that's for Luigi, obviously. And now for Henry.
I'm just like swooning and so happy to be here on this panel. Can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Let's hope it stays that way, but here we go. So I'm gonna begin with the words of the Black queer feminist genre-bending GOAT, Audre Lorde.
Woo.
And this is from her 1982 biomythography, Zami. Being women together was not enough, we were different. Being gay girls together was not enough, we were different. Being Black together was not enough, we were different. Being Black women together was not enough, we were different. Being Black dykes together was not enough, we were different. It was a while before we came to realize that our place was the very house of difference. So here Lorde is setting out to write a version of her life story in the 1982 narrative Zami, right? And she finds the genre conventions of the autobiography, the memoir, but also the myth and the novel to be insufficient, right? And so she creates what she terms a biomythography that brings together each of these forms, but also each of these narrative prose forms, but also incorporates lists, song lyrics, poems, several kinds of poems, in fact, letters, and several other kinds of writing. So rather than reformulate the story of her becoming, as she puts it, to fit any single genre rubric, Lord invents a new genre to accommodate her understanding of herself and her social experience. And those of us who know Lord, we also know that she's constantly invested in sort of articulating all of the different aspects of her identity as relates to power structures. So she's like, I'm a Black queer feminist, mother of two. And then another essay, she's like, I grew up fat, Black, half blind, and ambidextrous. And then another essay, she'll add poet or cancer survivor to those lists, right? And at the close of Zami, she expresses the kind of failure of her efforts to situate herself in identities or communities that are defined by only racial, gender, or sexual identity or difference. And in fact, even in combination, each of these identities and the communities that they claim, right, Black, woman, and dyke, is not enough to describe her understanding of herself and the communities she belongs to. So in my academic work, especially in my academic book, The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, I'm arguing that Lord kind of insists on queering form as a theoretical and also a political act. And, she develops what I think of in that book as a poetics of difference, right? A set of sort of subversive formal approaches or formal strategies that where writers bring together multiplicities of voice, of language, of form to respond to conversations about anti-racism, homophobia, ableism, decolonization, queer liberation, et cetera, mostly from like the late 20th century. So I'm excited to talk with you, Kazim, about period, right? The late 20th century into the current moment. And I think about these things in two different categories. People like Lord, who invent new genres and name them, like the biomythography. We can also think about Ntozake Shange, who invents this genre called the choreo poem, right? But I'm drawing connections to other sort of formal subversions, especially Black, queer, and feminist writers like Dion Brand, like M. Norbese Phillip, Akila Oliver, the photographers Zanelli Maholi, the queer Cuban non-binary hip-hop duo Las Crudas Cubensi, and the rapper Dr. Missy Misdemeanor Elliott, who got her honorary doctorate a couple of years ago from Berkeley. And so anyway, by mobilizing these multiple genres, right, genres, languages, voices, et cetera, simultaneously, I argue that these writers ask readers to develop new interpretive strategies that are attuned to difference and power in multiple ways. So in that excerpt that I just read from Lord, where it's sort of set aside as a kind of narrative prose poem in the middle of a chapter that looks pretty much like standard narrative prose, and it's italicized. So, thinking about the physical, visual body of the text, it sort of looks different, right? It looks kind of queer. And in addition to that visual signal of difference, we also have that sort of anaphora, the repetition of being blank together was not enough, right? And we hear it over and over again. And it requires readers to kind of encounter and touch and make contact with difference in multiple different ways, sort of thinking about and holding on to figurations of gender, of sexuality, of race, of queerness anew again and again and again. So I think of this again as a poetics of difference, and it's something that's really alive in my own fiction as well. These questions of queering language and intersectional difference really sort of animate my approach to form as a fiction writer. And that's been the case since way back in the day. And so I'm actually going to read an excerpt of a short story that I worked on when I was a fellow at the Center for Fiction many, many moons ago. I was part of the very first class of emerging writer fellows at the Center for Fiction. This is a story that I revised during my time there. It's called A Strange People. And it's from my first book, Blue Talk and Love, and it follows Millie and Christine McCoy, who are conjoined twins born into slavery, as they confront the many layers of their intersectional experience and their bodily experience, and they're trying to build a career for themselves successfully, to build a career for themselves as stage performers at the turn of the 20th century. And I think of this as a kind of queer subversion of form for multiple reasons. You'll see a bit about what that means in terms of craft, but also because when I was working on the story, a writing mentor told me that the short story was not the place to try to queer form. So I knew what I had to do. A Strange People. We, Chrissy, will let the white men see and touch our difference. She will smile for doctors and handlers like Mrs. Susan's old china trinket dolls, tilt her head just so and laugh, her hand grabbing at our hemline. In the next town, we'll see banners and broadsides proclaiming our charm. We, Millie, will not understand why they would write us that way. She will taste the words like coffee grounds in her mouth and wonder how they can print them so small and neat below the headlines. Double-headed darky, united negress freaks, two-headed African beast. We Chrissy will not have these questions. She will know that the nice words are for her. She is the one who has always hated us. When we were young, decades ago, we Chrissy wrote her version of our story, and everyone who knew us was surprised. She got most of the facts straight, told about our slave birth and the scandal we caused on our first master's farm, how we were sold from Master John and Mrs. Susan, then slipped like a wet hunk of soap from hand to hand, master to master, growing up and filling out on the carnival circuit. She told how we saw things most North Carolina nigger girls wouldn't even think to dream of, the darting English steam cars, the white-choked winter at the Cirque des Champs-Élysées. We Chrissy spent a few words on Wee Millie's favorite part of the life, when we ended up back in Mrs. Susan's arms. She said a couple of things about our life on the Midway, the place between the circus gates and the big top, where freak acts wander about and ballyhoo, squeezing awe from the norm's eyes like milk from fat cow's udders. Wee Chrissy is an all-star bally, always has been. She preened and flaunted in her story, too, playing our difference up and down to suit her audience. First it was a malformation, and then it was a joy. Our join was a curse we were proud of, she said, writing on our minds the paradox of our body. She refused to let them think for a second that the slightest drip of difference ran between we two. We are indeed a strange people, she began her story, and it continued just like that, a people, two, but one. She refused to tell anyone that it was she alone who had written the story, without letting Wee Millie so much as touch the pen or smell the ink when the manuscript was done. Wee Chrissy wrote then, and will tell anyone who asks now, that there is only one heart in the body. Wee Millie sits silent when she says this and lets her go ahead with her show. Wee Millie knows, though, that our hearts are separate. Our wombs, our backs, our hot puddles and buttons come in and out of each other like corset laces. Wee Chrissy feels Wee Millie's itches, and Wee Millie rubs on Wee Chrissy's aches, but for Wee Millie, our hearts are separate things, different as the sun and the moon, pinning down the ends of a long day's sky. So here, I'm sort of articulating my own version of this poetics of difference that I think about in my academic work, right? Trying to kind of queer the first person plural, we, in a way that here signals these characters' shared embodiment, literally the body or parts of the body that they share, but also the aspects of race, of gender that they have in common, and the fact of their corporeal difference, the fact of their conjoining, which is in itself a form of difference, especially in a kind of like, you know, ableist, normative vision of what a body should look like and should be. And so navigating the story asks the reader then to ask themselves a number of questions, right? What kinds of bodies are these being presented? Who are the women speaking? And most importantly, what are the differences of will, desire, worldview, and thinking between them? For me, this is part of a tradition of Black queer feminist work. And on this score, I refer always and often, again and again, to Audre Lorde, in whose essay, Poet as Teacher, Human as Poet, Teacher as Human, states, a writer by definition is a teacher. Every poem is an attempt at a piece of truth formed from the images of my experience and shared with as many people as can or will hear me. I am a human being. I am a Black woman, a poet, mother, lover, teacher, friend, fat, shy, generous, loyal, crotchety. If I do not bring all of who I am to whatever I do, then I bring nothing. It is this Black queer feminist drive to articulate the fullness of difference that lives at the center of my queer experiments in form, and in fact, all of my writing. This stance invites us to ungenre, to undiscipline ourselves, to push our work beyond the boundaries of form, provoking what for me is an endlessly generative question. How do we reimagine language to supply the missing words of our experience? A language that makes room not only for our present living and survival, but for our joys, our pleasures, and the boundless landscapes of our imaginative longings for queer worlds to come. Thank you.
Woo!
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Center for Fiction. It's amazing to hear you read Mecca and to be on this panel. It's very serendipitous to be with these other two because, so in 2018, the AWP was in Tampa, Florida. And I was living here. And I was like, okay, Tampa, Florida. I can go to Disney World maybe. And then I sort of like started to plan, and I was like, okay, it's really far from and impractical to like go between those places and still do this. And so I just spent the week at Disney World instead. And I was like, but okay, I can't not be a literary citizen, so I brought 2 books with me, and those books were Kazim Ali's Silver Road and Andrea Lawlor's Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl in its OG Rescue Press edition. I'm very proud of. And so, in my hotel room waiting for like Mickey's satanic breakfast ritual or whatever, I read these books. And something hit me when I was going to be on this panel. I was like, God, like if I hadn't done that, I don't know if this, what I'm going to read from Open Throat would have manifested. And so I'm going to read that and as just something full of love for these people and their work and the genre queerness of what they create. So this book is an unpunctuated sort of long-form monologue by a mountain lion in Griffith Park. And it's written, in these sort of shreds of line-broken prose, I imagine, like claw marks across a page. At this point in the narrative, our mountain lion, who was born with a dick, has found herself displaced from Griffith Park by a man-made wildfire, and has found herself living under a home of like a fading rock star celebrity. And that celebrity's daughter takes in the mountain lion and imagines that it is the goddess Hecate that it has summoned, so my lion becomes Hecate. I'm spoiling a lot about this book, but there's more to it, so grab it, enjoy it. I've never read from this far in the book, but I have to read this part. So Hecate and Little Slaughter is the name of the teen witch who takes her in and calls her goddess in this sort of expression of gender affirmation. This is when it sort of takes its dreamlike form. So they're in Little Slaughter's bedroom. Sorry, ooh, a little feedback. Little Slaughter sneaks chicken into me and I gnaw on a leg, and she spends the night telling me about a place called Disney. She tells me she wants to take me there. You'd love Disney, says Little Slaughter. There's animals everywhere, and all we have to do is jump in a car and get on the freeway and gun it to 70, and we're there. I close my eyes, and pictures appear. My eyes open, and the blurry distance stands still, but the world right outside the car shoots by at unbelievable speed. My paws are up on the dashboard, and I'm sitting in the passenger seat. I turn my head, and Little Slaughter smiles and rubs my back as she drives. I'm so much bigger than her, and my body takes up the whole right front of the car. Get excited, Hecate, she says. We're on our way to Disney. She lets go of me and grips the wheel. Other cars pass, and people turn their heads and smile, and children press their little hands and faces to the glass and scream silently. It's your birthday, Little Slaughter says. You're turning 5, and that's like 35 in cat years. This is your prime. It's weirdly quiet in the car, like we're in a bubble protected from the speeding world outside. The world outside slows down, and our car goes up in the air and leaves the long death below. Here we are, says Little Slaughter. We stop next to a bunch of other cars, and she jumps out and runs around and pops open my door, and my big body falls out, and I'm on all 4 feet again, watching kids and adults, and more people than I've ever seen swarm out of their cars and make a river of feet toward the sunlight. Little Slaughter claps, and I look up, and she's wearing a sparkling blue jumpsuit and ears like a mouse. Did she change, or... We join the river of feet, and we go down moving stairs and a polished sidewalk, me running beside her. I smell something so different that it's hard to describe, and as we come to a stop, and as a river of people forms a long, slow-moving line, I realize it's not what I smell, it's what I don't smell. No one is afraid. We reach a turnstile, and I start to walk under it, but a woman says, wait. Little Slaughter smiles at the woman, and the woman smiles back. Is this a service animal? Asks the woman. Yes, she's my emotional support cat, says Little Slaughter, and I have her papers right here. She reaches in the pocket of her jumpsuit, but the woman says, no, you're fine. The woman lifts my paw and presses a small wooden object gently against it. This is your hand stamp for re-entry in case you leave the park, says the woman. Oh, we won't, says Little Slaughter, but thanks. And she moves my paw and gets her own hand stamped. Now a quick picture, says the woman, and Little Slaughter turns her face, and I hear an electric click from the device. Now her turn, says the woman, and Little Slaughter grasps my neck and tilts my face up and says, smile for the picture, Hecate. And I do. I smile. The only time a cat has done that. Music and voices are everywhere inside the gates. There are other animals, big animals with soft fur and faces, and they stand upright and hug and blend in with the people, all the people with their own ears and hats and bright objects, and no one thinks I'm strange at all. And some of the kids come over and pet me, and Little Slaughter lets them, and they say, she's beautiful, and Little Slaughter says, it's her birthday. And the kids tie a birthday ribbon around my neck, and we walk down the wide main street together. There's a bench beneath the castle, and Little Slaughter sits me down there and says, stay. I stay and enjoy my stillness within all the motion around me. As soon as I get hungry, food appears. A huge bird leg that Little Slaughter holds out to me, and she has her own, and she sits down on the bench and she tears into the fat flesh. I look around and others are eating these big, ugly meats too, so I slobber and chew and join in. Gory, gory feasting. So far from Scare City. You must be this tall to ride, says Little Slaughter in the reading voice. She stands by a sideways stick in the air and holds her hand out to measure its height. Stand up, Hecate, she says, and I stand up like the other big animals in Disney, and now my neck is above the sideways stick. I'm a good emotional support cat, and I'll be tall for her. Perfect, says Little Slaughter, and we run to the front of the line, and they strap us into a log, and water sloshes over the sides, and she clutches my back, and the ride begins. There's darkness and color and animals singing and animals being tortured, and each time we go over a cliff, my stomach slams up into my throat, and I feel amazing. When we get off the ride, we're soaked, so I shake myself dry, and everyone around us screams and enjoys the water raining off of me. Look, Hecate, there we are, says Little Slaughter. And she points to a screen, and I see the screen clearly, and on it we're going down the big cliff, and Little Slaughter has her hands up, and her hands block the faces of the people on the ride behind us, and I look so scared of my own happiness. I love the photos, says Little Slaughter. Now, even if we leave, we'll still be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey.
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 How do you want to do it? Do we have some questions? Or answers?
Yeah.
I don't have any answers.
I don't have any answers.
No.
You look like you have answers.
I don't have answers. I thought, Megan, Mecca, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about in Blue Talk and Love, which it's one of my favorite short story collections of all time, and I love the range of different, modes and genres and forms you're playing within it. And I often teach stories from that in a queer fabulism kind of a context, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to fabulism and that lineage.
I mean, I will if you will, right? Like I'll answer that question.
Maybe we all
but then I'm
could.
gonna
Maybe
turn it
how about
around.
that? Maybe
that's
all
the
of us could.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, love it. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the story that I just read from, right, is maybe a little bit less so. I think it tries to approach a version of a queer fabulism through point of view, in the sense that, this is a character who's really sort of negotiating not only her own understanding of her body, but her relationship to her sister, with whom she shares parts of that body. And so there is an element of kind of fantasy on her own part. She's imagining her sister's perspective on the body, and as the story goes on, they're sort of moving through a number of different spaces. There's a shift in point of view where we see the fantasies about that body from the perspective of a producer in, the 1900s, right, very first decade of the 20th century. And so there's a lot of kind of narrative sort of messing with the possibilities of a Black body, Black woman body, a kind of non-normative body. But there are definitely other stories there where I think I go even further into just like using form to imagine another way of making space for queerness.
Like the anvil.
Yes, exactly, which is like the only satire I've kind of ever written. And that too is sort of I tend to work in kind of a deep interiority, and I think that's the case for a number of us in different moments, right? So, delving that deeply into a queer mind and into a queer inner world in some ways is a kind of fantasy place. And I actually found the short story as a form a really useful place to do that, partly because it's time limited. You can sort of bring the reader into a, kind of wacky, unpredictable, unexpected space, and then like release them back into, the quote unquote real world. Although this is then my like passing the mic to you, because of course, in Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, you are living in that world and you're sort of bringing us and keeping us in that world, moving us through a kind of, set of queer fabulations in a way that ends up feeling so, on one hand, surprising, but also deeply gratifying, right? Like we connect with the story in a way that I think is really challenging in some ways when you're doing something that's a departure from the real. So how did you manage that in the novel? Oh, you already have a mic.
I am mic'd. I don't know. I try not to do that thing again. It's so interesting because I stumbled for a minute and I started to call you Megan because I was thinking about Megan Milks, who
Shout out to Megan.
the three of us were all at the Temple creative writing program at the same time studying with Samuel R. Delaney. And I was just wondering to myself right now, like, look at the three of us doing this kind of like playing with this. And I think about what Kate Bernheimer calls in fairy tale is form, form is fairy tale. She talks about like four sort of aspects of fairy tale form, and one of them is normalized magic. And I was thinking about the ways in which you're really doing that, especially in the Anvil, but in other stories in that book as well. And I think in the collective we of We Strange People. And then I was thinking that relates to what I'm doing and certainly what Megan's doing, and a sort of a larger context of queer and trans fabulous writing, which I like would include Kai Cheng Tom's Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, or Tom Cho's Look Who's Morphing, or Zane Judikar's 30 Names for Night. Like there's a lot of like writers in the last 10 or 15 years. We've been playing with this sort of idea of normalized magic, and maybe it's a way to get at the thing that Kazim, you were talking about with Frankenstein, and this idea that, Mary Shelley being sort of against reason, in a way. So I'm passing it to you.
Well, because the logic and the reason of the Enlightenment did not exclude slavery and extractive capitalism, right? So it was bound to fail in that sense.
Yeah.
And we are in exactly the same moment right now. It is the same. It's the end of whatever we thought was the neoliberal Enlightenment of the 20th century, the mid-20th century onward, is like definitively over. I mean, whatever our resistance is now to all the fuckery of the moment, not to put too fine a point on it, is still not going to, like, the genie doesn't go back into the bottle suddenly because we somehow managed to survive the next 4 years. It's done, like now it's what is next. The problem is that what is next could be far worse than what came before. So that becomes the work of the moment to figure it out. But with Frankenstein, to talk about genre and gender one more time, is that the Black writer, the queer writer, the women writer, the trans writer has to create their own body in order to inhabit it, their own way of understanding and perceiving the world. So the mountain lion who is going to be an observer of the human condition from the outside and not understand it as the animal observer, but somehow also has to be able to speak legible enough English for the reader to read the book and understand it. So that's the craft aspect of that you are facing. But in Frankenstein, Victor is the sin. He's villainous because in the movie version, the assistant switches the brain for the criminal brain, and so then the monster is murderous, right? That's not the story. In the story, the scientist becomes villainous because he abandons his responsibility to the creature, and the creature becomes villainous because he wants human community and has asked Victor Frankenstein to build another body for him, a bride. And Victor is creating the bride and actually destroys the body. Like he's building it, He's in Scotland. He's in the Orkney Islands. I don't know why he goes there. He's Swiss, but he goes to Scotland to build the body, and he destroys it. And then the creature goes on the murderous rampage because he, as someone who's excluded from family life, excluded from having a family of his own, that is what he wants, and he becomes murderous when he's denied it. That is the story of Black people in America. That is the story of queer and trans people in America, too. So we create those genres to inhabit. Like, Paul takes the form of a mortal girl. All of the work that we're talking about is it has to enact that against whatever the other received genres were. It was Carol Maso at one of the outright conferences, and like, I think in 1993 or whenever she gave her speech. It's in her beautiful book, Break Every Rule, but she says, why does queer desire sound like, I think the example she used was John Cheever. Why does a gay writer write gay desire and sound like John Cheever? Was John Cheever actually?
He's bi,
He was
or,
bi, yeah.
you know.
But she was making a point about like a certain kind of fiction, you know? And then of course when she wrote her books, Ava and Ariel and all those other things, you know, Henry Ura's book is maybe in that lineage of like the fragment, you know, privileging the fragment instead of the grammatically normative sentence and paragraph and stuff like that. So we seek these different formal avenues to enact the reality of our politics, which are embodied literally in our bodies, and how our bodies as queer bodies and people of color and trans people and et cetera, have to function in this weird neoliberal capitalist world. And so then the role of the artist in the next iteration of whatever is going to happen is it's like so critical, you know?
Yeah. I think that like finding all these amazing sort of influences and writers who were, yes, working in fragmentary forms, and yeah, unexpected queer forms. Even just, I guess, thinking about my practice, it sounds so much like how you describe the Frankenstein creation and destruction. Like, I'm like, yeah, that's like how I create work. Is like, is a patchwork, is a bolt. It's, you know, there's all these elements of it that feel bizarre and monstrous and dangerous for me, but in a way that makes me very excited. And I think that the core is that the fragmentary form, I'm working in sort of like what I call like dares or like jokes. That's sort of how I approach books. I'm like, this won't work, like, let's do it. And that, to me, I always find such truth there, you know, and I think I find like, again, it's, you know, the same way that Frankenstein, the creature, is literate, you know, well, a little different, but like the mountain lion is not, you know, I'm not actually trying to convince you that this is a mountain lion. In fact, I wrote a memoir right after this, and this felt more like a memoir, writing this mountain lion voice. Like, somehow, like, it was very liberating to write outside of, it wasn't, you know, writing outside of my species, but to find all those things that, that I felt bizarrely and incongruously about the apocalyptic nature of Los Angeles, and then also just like the sort of chaotic nature of my own, the way I feel in my body, which is, you know, sort of ongoing and evolving and strange, but the ability to be ferocious and to claim agency and to find identity through another and a reflection. Like, those are sort of the things that I was able to find just through taking this dare with myself. And I think it had to have this, it had to, you know, follow such a beautiful lineage of genderqueer writers, and just even that concept I just love so much. And I've like, you know, subtitled a class that, just because I think that's how we find our own openness to both breaking with genre and with breaking with gender constraints through fiction, especially. I think it's just such a beautiful space, and like even the most, I don't know, you know, whoever we you know, synecdoche for mainstream or standard straight fiction or whatever, you know, like takes a genre and gender queer position in doing fiction. Like, I read, like, you know, and it's not like it's perfect, but I read something where I'm like, wow, Stephen King spent this inhabited, like, a femme space for 400 pages. You know, I'm just like, that's something. That's like a real task that pushed him past something that might have been binary in his life or in many of writers' lives. And, you know, for better or for worse, in the product sphere, that's still a very exciting thing to me, that everyone does that.
I love that. Let's just claim it.
Yeah, oh, please.
All fiction writers are trans.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
No, it is really interesting because it's like the things that we privilege about those stories, like it normalizes them. So we take the queerness out of it. So with Frankenstein, for example, like when we read Frankenstein and talk about Frankenstein, we talk about like the most normative aspects of the story, and we ignore how she actually enfolded the narrative in the nested narratives. Or Moby Dick, you know, where people talk about like the whaling chapters as being irrelevant, where it's like that's the whole point, you know?
The lists.
Or Willa Cather is another example in American literature where, you know, we talk about like the settler aspect of her writing about like the Nebraska prairies, but we don't talk about her super weird narrative structure. Like the professor's house has like a 70-page long digression right in the middle of it. And people don't really talk about like, why did she do that? Why did she interrupt the book? And she in her own letters talks about how, you know, she was very intentional about herself. I don't think she would have called herself a modernist, but she was for sure tending in that direction. And I mean, there is contemporary scholarship now that it positions her as a modernist. Janice Stout wrote a whole book, you know, talking about it. But if you look at all of Willa Cather's novels, O Pioneers, you know, My Antonia, you know, Sapphira and the Slave Girl, they're narratively very complex and strange. They do not follow this sort of like Aristotelian formula of fiction at all in any way. But I mean, Antonia disappears like 2/3 of the way through the novel that is like named after her. She's like, suddenly she's missing. And then Jim comes back however many years later and goes and sees her. And it's just, you know, yet those elements of the writers are like they're sort of like perceived or read. Once again, it's like a reading practice. They're read by critics, by students, by general public perception in a more normative way, even when what they were doing inside their own books was radical and revolutionary.
And don't you think, I mean, in some ways, for me, this is part of what's most interesting and fruitful about thinking about lineage and you know, sort of genealogy, right? That like what we are now maybe calling queer fiction or, you know, queer feminist forms or queer fabulation has historical roots, and yet we then have the opportunity to develop these reading strategies that can read familiar texts, not only for what's sort of different or unusual about them, but like what critiques they might be making in these queer forms, right? That like, so your question about, is there something about feminist approaches that sort of invites this queering of form, that to me is so rich and so interesting, because then we're not only talking about sort of, again, breaches of form, but we're talking about breaches of form to critique gender, power, right? And this, the notion of, you know, the Frankenstein, the interesting metaphorical relationships between enslavement, monstrosity, queerness, right? There's so much there, and I think it becomes most powerful when we're able to say, okay, this is because the genie was actually never in the bottle.
Never in the bottle.
Right? Yeah. And like now we get to, and maybe have to, especially here today in 2025, we have to like break the bottle, you know what I mean? And like say the thing and do the thing. And, you know, these queer experiments in form might be a set of ways to do that, because we're asking readers to like read in queer ways too. Yeah. And there's a lot of power in that.
It is why we also need to talk about the biographical with some of those writers themselves being queer. Willa Cather, Herman Melville, Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley maybe not, but gender-wise, she was definitely what we might consider now as genderqueer. And the critics in her day also talked about her herself as being monstrous, because she was doing in 1816, whatever, there were not so many women writers who were writing, but most of them that were writing in like philosophy or in, you know, poetry, or if they were writing fiction, they were maybe writing like, you know, they were constrained in the topics and the milieus. Here's Mary Shelley writing a radically political, creepy, weird science fiction and horror before there was that, you know? It was like completely, I mean, people, you know, I've been doing a lot of research on it, so I've been reading all this, you know, the contemporary reception to Frankenstein, and she was condemned, you know? It was appalling that this young, you know, she broke up a marriage, she was having children out of wedlock left and right, like in early 1820s, you know? And so she too was considered, she was called in one of the reviews monstrous for doing what she did, for living the life she was living and writing the book that she wrote. And she didn't stop. Like the next book, she wrote 7 novels actually. I mean, that's another thing, is like Joanna Russ, How to Suppress Women's Writing. I mean, there's like, she wrote a book, but she wrote, but she really only wrote one good book. You know, that's Joanna Russ's book. She says all the different things like she wrote, but look what she wrote about. You know, like that kind of thing. So with Mary Shelley, it's almost like we're only talking about that one book. There were 6 others after it that are, you know, equally transgressive. Yeah. Do we have time to, like, if there's any?
Can you talk about queerness and place, like land and ownership and how those things connect?
Very interesting.
I mean, I'll just, that moment in Lore that I shared, right? So where she, she's going through all of these configurations of identity and power and community. And then she closes with, it was a while before we came to know that our place was the very house of difference. And, every time I read that, it means something different to me. But essentially, I think part of what Lord is saying, and I think in this, it's part of what we're all saying maybe, is that like, in constructing fiction in particular, we are sort of making a space. We are making spaces. Our texts have bodies. The page has a materiality. We are creating structures, and we're inviting readers into those structures, right? And so, like, if we're creating spaces where queerness can do different things, feel different ways, kind of, and be radical, right? And be, anti-normative, can burn it all down. The books themselves, kind of at least give readers a taste of that if they want to do that work. And if they don't, it leaves them out of meaning, right? Like they're not in the space, which means they're not in the community. And that's a choice on the part of the reader. So it highlights for them, okay, I'm not willing to kind of like, learn to do the intellectual and interpretive work to enter this space. And that for me is a big part of why the work that we do is important.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really heartbreaking. I mean, this moment is incredibly devastating, I think. Not that most moments aren't, but I think we're all having a hard time keeping it together in this moment. But I think that I think about the fractal excitement of sharing work, like our work, or whatever, the work that I love that this was influenced by. The fact that these tiny fractal moments can be created with readers wherever they are. They find this book, and you can find it online, they find it in a library, a teacher gives it to them. Like, the fact that that connection is made and can start to just, like, it can have its own resonance with each person. And I think that, it's a funny part of this book because I think, I don't read a lot of reviews, but I've seen some people like, what was the queerness? Which is just so funny to me because I was like, really, like, this is ridiculously on the nose. Like, but I love that though. I'm like, okay, well then I'm stealthing it somehow into someone. They connect with the character, and they see, I think because of the animalistic nature, like if this was a story of a person, I don't think there would be much of a question. But I like that it exists outside of that to some degree, but obviously I am writing from a queer perspective and putting that in my book, and that's the point of the book for me. But I love that work can reach people and they can have experiences of it. I guess outside of, our books are very new, just in comparison to Mary Shelley or whatever. But I think, but the fact that, but that many, not that much newer, but
It's always new.
But like the fact that it can already be, like they already sort of, you can see the different elements of it be effaced, but they're still there, they're still embedded. And if someone just has the experience of it, that might start to work its way into someone. And I know someone who wrote it, Addie Tsai wrote a book on Willy Creatures, which beautifully spins Frankenstein, and to think that that's probably a book that they encountered like earlier in life, but then it stayed with them in this beautiful way as they developed and came into their identity as a writer and as a person. And I think that's something that I hope to do because it's what happened for me with those works, was just these little planted things. And I think that hopefully we can keep that persevering through everything that is happening to books in our world right now.
I love that idea of queerness and place, and the notion of the wanderer, or of as being a queer person having a compromised relationship in terms of like having to leave home maybe, or depending on where you live in the country, having to find community. I used to live in the Hudson Valley, and there was a club. It wasn't actually a gay club, but there were certain nights that were the gay nights. And you would go to this little place. It was like a little juke joint in the woods, basically, outside New Paltz. And people would drive for like 100 miles to come, because they'd be like living out in the Adirondacks or something, and then they would drive down for Saturday night at prime time. It was called prime time. So queer people are always kind of creating their own community or finding their own relationship to it. And so I have this trilogy to talk about genre. It's a trilogy that is invisible because the first book was published as poetry, although I wrote it as an autobiography, but I couldn't publish it as an autobiography, so it was published as a book of poetry. I didn't change a syllable of it. It just became a book of poetry. That's a book called Bright Felon. And then the second book is nonfiction, that's Silver Road that Henry mentioned, and it's comprised of kind of normative discursive essays and then sort of prose poem sections, and then there are poems, verse poems in there too. And then the third volume of the trilogy is fiction, and it's this book, Indian Winter, which just came out. And in each of these three books, the main character, who's me, is moving through different cities around the world, around the country, and trying to find a new relationship to place in each one. And so it was the trilogy got broken at the beginning, which is the second publisher did not want to kind of identify it as part of this continuous project. So it just became, Silver Road just became its own. And then Indian Winter sort of became its own. But what was really interesting is much after the fact with no intentionality at all, because Bright Felon came out in 2009, then Silver Road was 9 years later in 2018, and then this book came out this past year, 2024. So 6 years later, is three different publishing, 3 different presses, 3 different editors, 3 different designers, but the title font of each book is the same.
What?
Yeah, so when you put them next to each other, they have unity, and they each have a relationship to one other book in the trilogy, which is Bright Felon and Silver Road have the same color palette on the cover, and Indian Winter and Silver Road somehow, once again, independently are exactly the same trim size. So even though they weren't supposed to be, they were not identified as a trilogy, they kind of are identified as a trilogy. And to me, that was traveling across the genres was, what can a conception of poetry offer, even if you're writing in drag in poetry, like in the form of a poem, but transgressing against the boundaries of what a poem is. Same with the essay, like what is an normative essay? How am I going to challenge those distinctions? And then with fiction, same. How am I going to create a fiction in the way that I will myself create it? And then what is the obsession of the publisher, the reader, the critical establishment to know, quote, what a book is, right? And I think it stems from that same anxiety. It does stem from that anxiety around gender, taxonomy, classification. I have to know what it is so I know how to read it, which is going to help me, create my response to it, So, so these are the things that I think about when I go to sleep at night.
I love that. Can I say one quick thing? Because slightly off track of what people are saying, I've just been thinking about something Samuel R. Delany used to say, which was sort of writing advice to thicken up thicken the world with detail. And I think about my own writing as a little bit of I throw a lot of stuff in there. I love a list. I love nouns. And I think about place. And for me, place in Paul, place is very important. It felt important to get the locations that Paul is sort of going through really accurate, so that they were not anachronistic in detail. All of the detail felt like it was really important that you could just, it could be like a walking tour of Iowa City or Boys Town or something like that. For me, that was really important because of something that Gabriel Garcia Marquez articulated in a Paris Review interview where he says, if you say there are elephants flying in the sky, nobody will believe that. But if you say there are 42 elephants flying in the sky, and it's something about concrete detail and specificity feels very queer to me, and it feels like something about the sort of there's something, I don't know. I was just talking to Brian Tier last night about my queer insistence on frivolity being not a luxury. And so maybe I'll leave that there.
I like that. Yeah, great. Oh yeah, are we done?
Are we done?
Thank you guys. That was
Yeah,
good.
oh my God.
Yeah,
That's
we're
great.
done. Thank you, everybody. Write to your congressman about something. Just choose something.